time. I've never been here before. So I lived in the area. Great Falls. Now we live in Fallsburg. Okay. Okay, all right, I'll just play by ear. When people start looking like they're falling over, I'll say thank you.
We are about to start soon, so please stand by. I don't tell. Yeah, look at, I don't want to like it. Once you start talking, you'll be like.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's NIMIC seminar presented by the National Minerals Information Center, one of the U.S. Geological Survey Science Centers devoted to the research, analysis, and dissemination of minerals information. My name is Christopher Tuck and I will be the moderator for today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you all for being here, both at the USGS National Center and those of you joining us online on our Facebook Live event. During a sound check earlier, we were lucky enough to have thousands of people watching, join us from across the world. And I think we're going to see the same crowd here this afternoon. Very enthusiastic participators. We will be taking questions afterwards in a question and answer session, both from individuals in the audience and from those of you online. If you'd like to leave a question, if you're on Facebook, please leave a comment with your question and make sure you mention where you're at so we know where the questions are coming from. I'd also like to remind everyone that NIMIC Seminars has a new website, usgs.gov/NIMIC Seminars, which I recommend checking out for information on upcoming events, to sign up for our announcements, and to find more out about what we do at the center and on this team. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Associate Director for the National Minerals Information Center, Michael J. Magyar.
My name is Mike Magyar. I'm the Associate Director of the Center, and for those who may not be familiar with what we do and who we are, I thought I'd give a little background before we got started. The Secretary of the Department of the Interior is mandated by Congress to collect information on minerals occurrence, production, and use. For the last 20 years or so, that responsibility has been delegated through USGS and the Mineral Resources Program to our center here at USGS. Prior to that, it was at the U.S. Bureau of Mines. All total, our center has been at this minerals information function for more than 100 years. To accomplish this mission, we survey about 19,000 establishments involved in the mineral industry in the United States, covering about 85 non-fuel mineral commodities. And then we also send questionnaires to about 150 nations internationally to collect minerals information. All of that data is aggregated and published in a series of publications unique to our center, more than 700 per year. We aggregate the data so that nothing that is company proprietary information is ever disclosed. That is the core and the basis of all of our work that we do. It's all available on our website at minerals.usgs.gov/minerals, and there's about 10 years of all the publications that we do up there. Beyond the 700 publications that are our core, we work with agencies like Defense Logistics Agency, CIA, State Department, Commerce, and we do deeper dives, greater detailed studies of the material flow and supply chain associated with minerals essential to the U.S. economy and our national security. All of those are also published on our website as they become available. If you have any questions, our contact information is up there, minerals.usgs.gov/minerals. And I'll turn it back over to Christopher to get on with today's festivities. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We're very proud of what we do here, and I would suggest you definitely check out the NIMIC website, minerals.usgs.gov/minerals for more information. I'd also like to take this opportunity today to introduce our newest members to our team. Sitting over here, I know our Facebook folks can't see them, but we have Aaron McCullough, Robert Callahan, Graham Lederer, and Jamie Brainerd. I'd also like to thank Sinan Hastarun for his continued dedication to our program here. We are all volunteers, and we do this in addition to our regular day jobs as commodity, country, state, and materials flow specialists. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Mike Jarvis, Sophia Liu, Douglas, unfortunately I didn't get his last name, but Elisa Wilkins and Jane Ginnis and everyone else who helped us set this up today. We're very excited to be reaching out to our online audience. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Graham Lederer to discuss our upcoming presentations.
Thank you, Chris. So I have the honor of introducing a few upcoming talks, so very exciting time and NMIC seminars coming up. In September, on the 16th, we have a talk on the mineral resources and industry of Iran by Jürgen Kretschmann, coming all the way from Germany. So you'll definitely want to sign up for the listserv to be notified about these talks. In October, we have a talk on the lithium-ion battery supply chain by Andrew Miller, who has actually been here before and gave a really interesting talk on the graphite anodes. So another not-to-miss seminar coming up in October. And lastly, in December, we have a seminar on mapping Middle East deposits. So this is one of our own, Lyle Mars from the USGS. And all three of these talks will be down here on the first floor of the USGS building in the Visitor Center. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sinan Hastarun, who will have our last introduction for our speaker today.
Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the NIMIC seminar series. I'd like to welcome Scott Kennedy. We're very honored to have Scott, Dr. Kennedy, speak to us today on China's economic rebalancing. Dr. Kennedy is a Deputy Director and a Freeman Chair in China Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kennedy is a leading authority on China's economic policy and its global economic relations. Specific areas of focus include industrial policy, business lobbying, multinational business challenges in China, Chinese participation in global economic regimes, and philanthropy. Dr. Kennedy is the author of The Business of Lobbying in China and the editor of 3 books, including Beyond the Middle Kingdom, Comparative Perspectives on China's Capitalist Transformation, and The Dragon's Learning Curve, an upcoming book, The Dragon's Learning Curve, Global Governance and China. Dr. Kennedy holds a PhD in political science from George Washington University, and he also obtained a MA in China Studies from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. With that, I'd like to once again welcome Dr. Kennedy to the National Minerals Information Center.
Good afternoon. It's a real honor to be here. I want to thank Storm for the kind introduction, Nimic for the invitation, and for all of you coming here, and for the many more that are sitting at their desks or on the beach with their cell phones and iPads open, trying to learn today about China. I can tell that based on the others who were scheduled to speak this fall, that my topic may be a little bit different than the typical type of lecture that is presented, and I think that's okay. It's good to get a variety of different points of view. I do follow commodities in China and broader trends in that area, but I'm going to talk to you today about broader trends in China's economy, its politics, which have implications for the type of work that you all do and for others that are in this space. So what I'm going to do is try to provide some context where China is going, because certainly supply and demand in China have an effect on mineral markets, which is relevant for businesses, for governments as well. But I want to focus on the broader picture first, and then you all will guide me to decide what specific things during the Q&A you really want to focus in on, and then I'll help you as much as I can, and where I can't, well then I'll jot down as many questions as I can and get answers back to you. But I've been following China now for 28 years. First went to China in 1988. Go there regularly this year. I've already been 5 times. I've got several more trips coming up, and it shows my love for United Airlines, even though they don't love me. But China's a fascinating place, and for most of the time I've been following China over these 3 decades, I've been an optimist. Just if you know Chinese people, if you've watched where China has been, where it's how far it's come, having a glass half full view of China is not a bad bet. All the folks who have been thinking that China was going to collapse, who want to go short on China, they've all lost. They've all lost a lot of money. So in general, I've been an optimist on China, but I would say the past couple years, I've not been. And now I'm actually quite worried about the direction that it's going in. And I wanted to explain why and what the implications are for those that engage China. So as you know, China today is led by Xi Jinping, who's the president of the country, he's head of the Communist Party, he's head of the military. He needs several business cards to interact with others. Very long list of titles. When he was selected to be China's leader in 2007, as Hu Jintao was getting ready to start his 2nd term, they identified Xi Jinping as his successor. And so Xi Jinping had 5 years essentially to decide, well, what kind of leadership would he provide. And as he was looking at China then, he noticed a variety of problems and challenges. The first was that China had an economy which was very mediocre. It had grown, but was highly inefficient. It wasn't dominant in any industries, and it had a variety of problems. China also had environmental problems, lots of issues to resolve. Politically, China had a lot of corruption, rampant corruption, where officials had benefited immensely from their positions to enrich themselves. That was totally out of control. In addition, within China, they had allowed for the growth of civil society organizations, NGOs, foundations, media organizations, law firms, and others that to help govern the country. But these organizations weren't all being, toeing the line. They were putting a lot of pressure on the party, And as China looked at color revolutions elsewhere in the world, they were quite concerned about these groups. Lastly, he looked at at China's global position and realized that China didn't have the type of influence that he thought it should, that it was relatively weak, it was passive, it was basically had to maintain good relations with the United States no matter what, because the U.S. was so dominant. So Xi Jinping saw a range of problems as he was coming into office, and he had a variety of things that he could have done. The first would have been the suggestion that would have come from Americans, and Westerners, and liberals. He could have liberalized across the board. He could have opened up China's economy, reduced government intervention, reduced barriers to international trade and investment. That would have been one way to approach the economy. He could have liberalized China's political space to give civil society groups more room, give them clear authority, protect them, provide a clear legal foundation for their operations. He could have introduced rule of law to deal with corruption. Instead of a political campaign, he could just give judges and the police much more independent authority to investigate and prosecute corruption wherever they found it, perhaps via an independent commission, which is the way, for example, Hong Kong and Singapore have dealt with corruption. And he could have tried to improve relations with the United States and develop a strategic partnership based on a shared vision for their respective roles in the world, for global governance institutions, and for international rule of law. So that would have been one set of things that he could have done that would have had a pretty consistent theme to them, and that many mentioned. He didn't take that advice at all. He, in fact, went in the opposite direction on every single one of those. So he has spent his entire, the last several years since he came into power in late 2012, cracking down on civil society, reducing their space, eliminating the gray zones for NGOs, for lawyers, for nonprofits to operate. He has, in addition to that, an anti-corruption campaign which has been very aggressive, highly politicized, not based on independent rule of law. And he's had a foreign policy which has meant to increase China's voice in the system and within Asia challenge the U.S. military for dominance in the region. Anyone who has followed East Asia or gone to the CSIS website or read the New York Times has seen the photographs of what China has been doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere. It really endears us to the Chinese embassy, having those pictures up there. So those have all occurred. In addition, changes in economic governance, which I want to focus mostly on today, all consistent with each other, all center around the idea of control, of expanding control, state control. And that's how they have focused. And there's a lot of consequences for that trend, which is very different from how China was governed before Xi Jinping took over. In terms of economic policy more specifically, in general, as I said before, I'm an optimist about China. It has a lot of growth potential, despite the fact that you've got a demographic shift that is leading to the graying of the population, of much higher proportion of people who are retired relative to those who in the active workforce over time because of China's one-child policy. And eventually all those people, that just shifts. You can just watch the trend over time and how the demographics shift. China's environmental problems extremely serious. And just simply math, which you all know much better than me. It's just the increment that you need to keep the same percentage of growth each year in absolute terms, that just keeps getting larger the bigger you are. And so it's just simply hard to sustain long-term growth. And China's done it. China's grown at 9+% per year for 38 straight years. So those things all suggest a slowdown, but there's many reasons that China has the potential to continue to grow at a relatively high rate for another decade or two. It still has an extremely smart population, it has excellent logistics, and there are so many policies that all of us could think of that they could adopt to make their economy much more efficient. They could liberalize services, they could extend the retirement age, they could make it easier for labor to move around the country. There's just a long list of things that they could do to make this economy more efficient. But they decided they didn't want to do those things. Instead, what they've done under Xi Jinping is they have doubled down on government intervention across the board. China talks about reform all the time. It's one of the favorite buzzwords the Chinese use. Go to any Chinese government website, media organization, and you'll see the word reform all across the page. Xi Jinping created a leading small group on comprehensively deepening reform. There is the leading small group for reform of soccer in China. Many areas of reform they're focusing on. Notice the Chinese didn't have any teams in the Olympics in soccer. So, but the idea of reform in China has been totally separated from the idea of what it used to be, which was liberalization and marketization. So if you look, for example, this is a long list of things that the Chinese have done related to intervention. From a little over a year ago when the Chinese intervened in the stock market, first they intervened to push the market up. China's real estate market was suffering, was an obvious bubble. They were worried, so they figured, well, let's pop that bubble, and what we will do is push money into real estate, into the stock market. So they did that. 2014 to 2015, the price of the stock market went way up. And then, lo and behold, gravity kicked in, and the stock market collapsed. The Chinese government intervened haphazardly, causing lots of problems, reducing confidence in what they were doing. Then about a year ago, last August, the Chinese announced some reforms related to how the renminbi's exchange rate is set, and they totally bungled that. They said that they were doing that to reform and liberalize that exchange rate system to prepare China to have the yuan join the SDR basket that the IMF oversees. But other Chinese government officials said what they were really trying to do was spur Chinese exports by because they devalued at the same time they announced those reforms. And markets really didn't take this well. The renminbi went up and down for several months until the Chinese intervened in capital markets and are still intervening today. Last September, the Chinese announced plans to reform state-owned enterprises. China still has 150,000 SOEs that account for about 1/3 of industrial output. They account for 2/3 of credit to industry in China. So that's not a good balance. SOEs have about 1/3 the return on assets that private companies in China do. So they are a big sink and need to be addressed. So last September, when they announced the reforms, they announced the most paltry, limited policy changes one could imagine, basically suggesting that they had no idea what they were going to do. They didn't want to privatize SOEs. They don't want to bankrupt SOEs that are going bad. They want to instead merge SOEs with each other, have good ones take over bad ones, reduce the pay for the leaders of SOEs so that they make incomes more like government officials. I don't know what benefit that would have other than making them want to find outside income, but nevertheless, that's something that they mentioned. Another idea they had is, I don't know if you all are familiar with Singapore, has a very large state-owned investment company called Temasek. And they thought, well, we could follow the Temasek model. Temasek is a holding company under the Ministry of Finance in Singapore. It has outside boards of directors. It has about 100 plus companies that it oversees, all of which operate according to market principles, no government intervention from the Singaporean government. And the Chinese said, well, maybe we could do that. Maybe we could, instead of directly managing state-owned enterprises, we could just sort of manage them like capital, right? But not intervene in what they do day to day. If you know how China operates, if you know that Communist Party organizations are inside SOEs, have a lot of role in managing SOEs. In China, independence is not a word that you actually see practiced a lot. So if China follows the Temasek model, it will do everything that the Temasek model has, except everything that the Temasek model has. which means they won't do anything like the Temasek model. So that's not possible. And since then, they've announced a variety of reforms to SOEs, all of which add up to 0. In March of this year, China issued its latest 5-year plan. China still has 5-year plans, which go back to the early 1950s. These are indicative plans. This isn't input-output tables that engineers use, but these are indicative targets. Nevertheless, the 5-year plan are bright neon lights that tell everybody what the direction of economic policy is going to be, what their priorities are, where money is going to be spent, where it won't be spent, which is a signal to officials across the national bureaucracy, to local government officials, what they ought to emphasize, what they ought to not emphasize, what will affect their promotions, and it signals to companies and countries that interact with China. If China's got a priority in some area, well then it'd be a really good idea if your company got involved, or even if you weren't directly involved, to market it, to make it look like that was your priority. So these plans are extremely important. And the plan that they issued in March, we wrote our own report on the plan, which is on our website. It is very forward-looking in terms of what they want the economy to look like in 5 years and even beyond, in terms of restructuring away from heavy investment in infrastructure, toward services, away from assembly and manufacturing, towards design and innovation and high tech, toward a much greener environment, less use of fossil fuels, much more renewable technologies, greater conservation, a whole long list. I mean, I don't think anyone in this room, all of us together, could have come up with a better list of economic targets of ways they wanted to make the economy be much more effective, much more efficient, at least in terms of outcome. But in terms of how they would get there, this report, the plan, depends heavily on government intervention to achieve every single one of these goals. To reduce capacity and production in energy-intensive industries and infrastructure. It's all about government intervention to identify and force the closure of companies that are producing these things. To have government spend trillions of dollars on subsidies and funding for companies to develop products. China's developed a leading small group on semiconductors, for example. And this is basically sort of the China Inc. Board of Directors for how to develop China's semiconductor industry. China currently imports almost all of the semiconductors that it uses that go into things that are in your pockets or purses today, so your phones and everything. Those all come from abroad. And so the Chinese would like to actually move up the technology ladder in semiconductors. So they've already earmarked, I think this year, somewhere around $130 billion US in R&D to develop their own capacity. Not only has the central government done that, but almost every provincial government has a semiconductors development plan to create their own fabs. Counties in China have that. Can you imagine Fairfax County, Arlington County, Rappahannock County, Montgomery County, all having their own plans to raise money and develop their own fabs? Well, that's not a great idea. So government intervention in China used to be, China's always intervened in the economy, right? It's never been a pure free market. That's a joke. But there's a few reasons why it was more effective than what I'm describing now. The first is that China was essentially catching up for the last 30-some years. And when you catch up, you know the target, you just throw a bunch of money, a bunch of smart people, organize. Catching up that's a reasonable way to use government intervention. China's now at the technology frontier in many industries, and picking winners and losers is hard for the markets, let alone for government bureaucrats. So, and then when you've got a financial system like China's, where there aren't hard budget constraints, and government officials see no losses from making bad choices, that makes things even worse. So All of those things suggest that the type of approach they had before is not going to work and they need to change. And then in addition, despite the fact that China has always had a lot of intervention in the economy, the way the dynamics of the political system always encourage going in a different direction and using market incentives, adjusting. So China is a big place, right? A lot of bureaucracy, a lot of different ministries, commissions at the national level, 34 provincial level bodies. I think China has 2,000 counties, 700,000 villages. It's a big place. And when you don't have a very authoritarian leader at the top who tries to control everything, you get a lot of different voices speaking up. So you get different leaders discussing with each other what they think policy ought to be. You get different bureaucracies putting their 2 cents in. You get different localities putting their 2 cents in. And usually the product of that is a negotiated policy outcome in which the sharpest edges of government intervention usually get reduced, or you find some advocate someplace for a market solution. So you've got, for example, local governments competing to attract investment from General Electric, for example. And so to attract General Electric investment, they'll not only provide tax holidays and other things, they'll provide other types of benefits or things that help GE do business in China, reduce big market entry barriers. And that competition between localities or between different bureaucracies always ended up helping encourage a more liberal outcome than what even the most hardline nationalists, protectionists in China would want. In addition, China's, over the last 20 years, business lobbying has emerged in China, something I wrote about. And businesses in China lobby not only for protection, but they also lobby for openness. So you can think of an anti-dumping case when you've got Chinese steel companies seeking protection from foreign steel. Downstream industries like Chinese automakers, oil companies lobby against that because they want to import the higher quality steel than they can get domestically. So you've got, essentially as a result of all of those things, what I call porous protectionism. And now that you have a much more centralized hierarchical system with Xi Jinping firmly in control, no other leaders contending with him, an anti-corruption campaign which is quite vigorous, scares the bejeebers out of everybody, central and local, to not want to cross him, that reduces the ability of this system to move in a liberal direction, even when there's a policy difference in Beijing. So there is that phrase, the Chinese have this phrase, the sky is high and the emperor is far away. Basically means that localities can kind of get away with what they want because it's just too many places to control. Well, now under Xi Jinping, the sky isn't quite as high, the emperor isn't quite as far away as he used to be. So the result of extensive government intervention is essentially an economy that's continued to grow, but not grow in a healthy way. It now takes $9 to get 1 unit of GDP growth. Several years ago, it would only take $2 to get 1 unit of GDP growth. So that's 4.5 times. That's a horrible trend. So even so they are spending way more to get the same unit of GDP growth than they had before, and that's a bad trend. So, and the only way you're going to get a better trend is a much more efficient economy where you raise productivity of human capital, financial capital, of finance, and the policies that they have in place now aren't going to get them in that, move them in that direction. So, where are things going? I think, first of all, I think a crisis is highly unlikely in China, a financial crisis. Some people think that debt can only pile up so high before bankers call it in. Well, I remember in 1988 when I was in college in the United States, just getting interested in China, and the U.S. had a trade deficit of about $50 billion a year. People said, "Man, it can't get much higher." And the U.S. federal government had a budget deficit under Reagan of about $80 billion a year, or something like that. So it couldn't get any higher. The U.S. is just going to get wiped out. Well, lo and behold, here we are, 28 some odd years later. We've got 19 plus blank trillion of debt, and everyone's still buying American treasuries, stock markets at all-time highs. Things aren't. We did have a little crisis, not even little, but nevertheless, it could go on for a really long time. And the Chinese are actually in a better position to extend things than we are. They've got far more savings in their banks than we do, savings deposits. They have $2+ trillion in foreign exchange reserves. They can open and close the capital account in China with the push of a button. No one's going to get in the way for that. And if they need to, they can print all the money that they want. So a financial crisis is really unlikely in China. So I think if they pursue the track that they're on and don't change, then for me what the most likely outcome is instead of China having a crisis, what they're going to do is push all of the adjustment costs on everybody else. So what you're going to see is continued stimulus to try and keep the economy growing, which would be sort of high-calorie, cheap stimulus that gives short-term results, but leads to a lot of volatility. And so you're going to see volatility in China's housing market, in other areas of infrastructure, in high-tech, and that volatility is then going to spill over to the rest of the world because China's market isn't entirely closed. Obviously, the world's largest trading country. Their capital markets are somewhat open. And as we saw last summer, in the beginning of this year, when Chinese markets get excited, we get really excited. And last August 11th, the morning they announced their foreign exchange reforms, and people didn't know what was going on, they thought it was a devaluation. The New York Stock Exchange opened that Monday morning and went down 500 points right away. So I expect a lot of volatility in financial markets as a result, but I think the biggest concerns that I have aren't financial markets, because I don't have any money. I work at a think tank, so I don't have any investments to depend on, so wherever the market goes, it's just, I'm like sitting in the woods, ready to retire. But what I am worried about are physical markets and the industries associated with them. So if you give you an example, last year, China, and I might not have the exact numbers right, but just for example, take aluminum, for example. So last year, China produced, I think, somewhere around 31 million tons of aluminum. Don't worry about the math. But they only consumed 29 million tons, something like that. So there were 2 million extra tons of aluminum that they needed to do something with. So what they did is they exported those. Some they exported directly, some they sent to Vietnam, smelted down, and then sent it out in a different form. So that's 2 million extra tons on the global market for aluminum. That sent aluminum prices down. Now, if you're a company like Alcoa that doesn't have the loose budget constraints of Chinalco and Chinese aluminum providers, that's a big problem. And just look in the papers this year, what did Alcoa do? Alcoa split into two, and a lot of the aluminum business that they used to be in, they're not in anymore. And if you look at steel industry, similar problem, but magnified. Since China makes 54% of the world's steel, consumes 60-some-odd% of the globally traded iron ore. Prices for steel have gone in the same direction, and same consequences for U.S. steel manufacturers, and same in Europe. So China could do for semiconductors what they've done for aluminum and steel, and for a lot of other products. Now that's a market share problem, but it's actually more about business model. It could really hurt the basic business models of those sectors if it doesn't get its house in order and change. So it needs to become much more efficient. So imagine China that continues to grow on cheap calorie stimulus and say triple the size it is now, right? So it goes from having, say, 30 million tons of aluminum to producing, say, 100, right? And if it still has this sort of the same gap, then it'd go from 2 million tons of difference to 6 million tons, right? Now, 6 million. Now imagine 6 million tons on the market. So China actually has to triple its efficiency over the time it grows in order to make it so that the market consequences globally don't rise anymore. So China has to become much more efficient enact to spare the rest of the global economy. So to me, that's a big, big challenge for China. And all of us have a lot at stake in China getting it right, simply because it's so big. If China were Ethiopia, if it was Burundi, if it was Bolivia, it wouldn't really make a big difference on global markets and the effect of others. It'd be a bad story regionally and for China, but it wouldn't have such a big effect. So China's size gives it a lot of opportunities. It also gives it way more responsibilities. But it also puts a lot of responsibility on us on trying to guide the Chinese and encourage them. When you talk to, I'll just wind up with a couple words. When you talk to Chinese, they try to, especially officials, they will argue that they are engaging in this important structural reform, and the data shows that yes, China's moved from industry into services. Services, as of the end of July, were accounting about 54% of GDP, much higher than 38% 10 years ago. And consumers are consuming at a faster rate than ever before. So they are making that transition, but not in an efficient way at all. Most of the rise in services, actually in financial services, people doing trades, speculators. Well, I love speculators, but I don't see why that's counted as growth in GDP. That transition is not really significant for making China's economy more efficient or for solving their core problems. The people on the other side, the people who worry about debt, as I said, I don't think that's likely. I think what we're likely to see is what I said, the problem being pushed on everybody else. So if you do think, in terms of policy choices, if you think China is getting things right and gradually transitioning, then it's just about patience. Give them time. It's complicated. It's a big place. You've got to give Xi Jinping some slack. Eventually they will fix this because they want to. It's just complicated. If you're worried about the debt problem and you think that's where everything is situated, then what you want to do is tell them, hey, get your debt under control, and then you want to protect Americans and the rest of the global economy. Don't have your pension funds go invest in China. Don't let the Chinese issue debt abroad or in the United States. Basically keep that as separated as you possibly can. If you think it's about the potential for China to continue to grow and push everything on everyone else, then patience is a horrible idea. Really what you need to do is you need to explain to the Chinese why their current path is bad for them, and they could have things much better. And you also need to prepare your industries to be able to deal with, in case that isn't what happens, the volatility that's coming. There's going to be much more volatility than we've been used to before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank him again for such a wonderful presentation and add to it, if I may. One of the comments that we had online, they spoke of the reliance that we have on these minerals and the products they go into, specifically iPhones in this instance. But Scott touched very handily on the steel industry and the crisis it faces and import reliance and the international trade balance, making sure competition doesn't interfere with the U.S. and its industry. And that's a big topic of what we research and look into in the way that minerals interact. So minerals go into everything, and that's one of our big points here. They go into phones and cars and buildings and everything. So China and their influence on that industry is going to be felt everywhere when we do see, as you said, possibly volatility. So I'm a big fan of crowdsourcing, so we want to make sure we ask everybody now that we have done if they'd like to add a comment on Facebook and where they're from. We'll make sure we address that in the Q&A. And also to submit your ideas about future mineral seminars online at our website, usgs.gov/NMIC seminars. And also, if you enjoyed today's presentation, we are growing our archive of past presentations, and in the coming weeks we will make available a number of our videos for those presentations as well. So look forward to that great resource. And we'll let Scott take a quick break, and Sophia Liu is going to share some information on a mineral resource program crowdsourcing project that she's working on. So, Sophia.
Hi, thank you so much. much. My name is Sophia B. Liu. I'm an innovation specialist at the U.S. Geological Survey, and I appreciate this opportunity. I really want to just put out there, you gave a really good example and many stories on the complexity of this issue around critical minerals in China. And I think what we do really well at USGS is we have a lot of amazing statistics and data that's in these books. What I hope to do is try to explore how can we present this type of data in new ways? How can we create much more data-driven stories? Be able to engage a variety of users in sort of engaging in these efforts around understanding critical minerals. So this is sort of a call out to any volunteers, both in-house here internally at USGS, but also any of those online that are interested in trying to engage in how we can tell better stories around critical minerals, especially in the age of web and other interactive visualizations. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Cheers.
All right, we're going to go ahead and bring Scott Kennedy back up, and to lead our Q&A today, Ms. Erin McCullough, and our gentleman microphone handlers, Mr. Graham Letter and Jamie Bernard. So if you have any questions in the room, please just get their attention, and I'll turn it over to Erin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy, for your thoughtful presentation and for graciously taking time out of your busy day to join us. This time I'd also like to acknowledge the audience in-house with us in Reston, Virginia, and to thank the online community for their stimulating conversation as well. Chris mentioned the comment about the minerals in iPhones. This is true, and I would also, at this time, like to open the floor to our audience with us live. At this time, we have no other online questions, but if you're live with us, please send them in and we will acknowledge them.
Thank you. I'd like to tie the question to the three different themes that you had. One is the drive for more centralized government. Two, the fact that control seems to be dispersed with provincial and local governments. And three, that there is an oversupply or an overcapacity in such things that you mentioned in steel and aluminum. There have been central government policies trying to rationalize and close inefficient and polluting industries in order to cut pollution as well as energy usage. I know they have an inefficiency in their grid system. Yet at the same time, we're not seeing this happening because of the local provincial interest in keeping employment up and so forth. So there seems to be a push-pull. Do you see the rationalization actually catching hold and more of it taking place in the future?
Sure. That's a great question. I know that China's heart is in the right place economically, but I think the approach that they're taking, it's the way that I deal with the weeds in my yard. I cut them down and they grow right back. I actually don't fix I don't make my lawn more beautiful and more healthy. And I think we need to ask, why did China have an overcapacity problem in the first place? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce had a report on this, and then also the EU Chamber of Commerce in China wrote also an excellent report on overcapacity as well last year. And it's something that I've tried to pay attention to. And I think the core of the problem is China's financial system. Of course, there are bouts of oversupply. I mean, that's normal. You're going to have disequilibrium all the time. Markets are usually in disequilibrium. So that's not the problem. The challenge is that in China, there are still so many distortions, particularly in financial markets, that there are few serious incentives or penalties for overinvestment. Because local governments have ties to banks, big companies have ties to local governments and to the banks, so that if things go badly, they don't have to face the consequences. So I'm in favor of local competition. I want Reston to compete for hosting companies, innovative government institutions with Austin, Texas, that competes with San Diego, that competes with others. But if things go badly, the folks that made the investments ought to face the music. And in China, you don't face the music. Your loans get rolled over, your bonds get renewed, you don't go under. And so the moral hazard problem that's endemic in China's financial system is what keeps this going on. It's what makes local governments not want to listen to Beijing. So until you fix that moral hazard problem that's at the core of the financial system, basically what you're doing is you're solving the problem momentarily, but it's just going to come back. And of course, the amount of overcapacity that China had now is much larger than the previous bouts of overcapacity that they had, say, 1994 to 1997, or early in Hu Jintao's administration when he came in and they just threw a ton of money at the system just after SOE reform. So, but it's getting bigger. So, you know, our suggestion still is that they're not going to fix this problem until they fix the financial system. So I think the problem doesn't lie in Bengbu, Anhui, China. It lies in Beijing. And once you fix the there, then that principal agent problem becomes much easier to address. So that's where, you know, then my Chinese friends say, well, that's impossible. As long as the Communist Party is in power, they're not going to change this because they need to control the financial system because they're based on industrial policy. Well, then you're just going to be, you know, cutting weeds.
Thank you so much. We'll have another question from the audience, please.
My question is about the role of China in international development, and specifically Africa. In the latest IMF World Bank review of panel discussion on China, there was a lot of talk about the role of China, and even in supporting infrastructure in Africa. So many of the countries in the world are not looking for United States or Europe to support their development. They are looking at China.
I mean, I think it's amazing the transition that China has gone from being a recipient of foreign aid to being a provider of foreign aid. China's essentially graduated. Although I think there's still some World Bank projects in which it receives some funds in some parts of China, which is hard to believe given how wealthy the country is now. You know, there's a lot of, you know, potential criticism, and the criticism has been made of Chinese investment or, you know, aid in Africa as being tied to Chinese business. That they'll only build infrastructure, stadiums, roads, telecom networks, if the business goes to Chinese, or if Chinese workers can carry them out. I think the research is much more mixed on actually what they're doing, and there's been a lot of success. Not entirely, but look at the portfolio of U.S. foreign aid, AID, for example, and how things have worked out, or even the World Bank. So China created the AIB at the beginning of last year, and that's in my mind a good opportunity to put a little bit more pressure on the World Bank and other multilateral development institutions to improve how they do business. I'm a little bit, you know, I think when people were looking at the creation of the AIB originally, their view was, well, this was just simply going to be a stalking horse for China to promote state-owned enterprise exports and benefit China, not the regions. And I could see there being some legitimate concern. I thought the U.S. government went too far in essentially opposing by encouraging other Western countries to not join. The U.S. was never going to join because the U.S. Congress would never allocate the funds for the U.S. to become a member. But the U.S. took a very much more assertive stance against the creation of the bank. That was a mistake because the bank is going to be created anyway, regardless of what the U.S. position was. And so I think if the U.S. was really concerned about the bank, what they should have done is encourage its creation. They should have said, good luck. We hope it goes well. And then if it goes well and it adapted to international norms and maybe improved upon them, then the U.S. could say, look, we didn't get in the way of this new Chinese initiative. We welcome China to participate in global economic governance and provide a leadership role. If it had gone poorly, then the U.S. could have said, well, we told you so, not our fault, but no one else was paying attention. So I think now it's very difficult to unring that bell, and the U.S. is now going to, if things go wrong with AIIB, many would look to the U.S. AIIB has done a lot of work to try and collaborate with the World Bank, with the Asian Development Bank, and others, and I think actually once they start issuing their loans and doing projects, it'll be interesting to see. Infrastructure is a very difficult area because it's hard to find bankable projects that will generate eventually a return that will yield, that will justify them and need to pay back the loan and generate ongoing income creation. But there's a huge infrastructure gap, and so funds are needed. The U.S. can help not necessarily with all the money, but with technical assistance, coordination, bringing the private sector in, whether that would be in Asia or in Africa. I think there's a lot more the U.S. could do. I think the Obama administration actually has been quite creative in figuring out how they can do more with less funds. So I think that the trend is going to be how can you take Chinese money and American know-how and put those two things together and bring the private sector in. The one area that I'm still worried about, which goes back to my talk, is if China's domestic economic policy continues the way it is, and it doesn't become more efficient, and it generates more bouts of overcapacity or the opposite, then China's going to be using foreign aid or the Belt and Road or other types of international arrangements to solve their domestic problem, basically hive off this excess capacity. And I think that's not necessarily going to be a good thing for those countries, whether they're in Africa or Asia or other places. If China institutes more thoroughgoing economic reform and liberalization, then I think that would have a positive spillover on the types of collaborations that it has in Africa and elsewhere.
I'd like to pose a question that was submitted to us from our online community. During your conversation today, you mentioned steel and aluminum briefly. This one pertains to rare earth elements. And the question is, doesn't China control a lot of the rare earth element deposits? And then the question would be, what does this mean for us?
Sure. Yes, it does. And I first started paying attention to rare earths in 2009 and 10. As people will remember, in 2010, the Chinese Navy ran into some Japanese fishing boats. Or maybe it's Chinese fishing boats ran into Japanese Navy. The result of that was China closed off its rare earth exports to Japan. It notified, basically told customs, don't let any of these things go out. So that was the first time the world paid attention, because everyone knows what rare earths go into. They're not actually very rare, but they go into a whole variety of high-tech things, civil and military. And in the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s, which produced a lot of rare earth minerals, stopped because of the environmental consequences of doing so. And so a lot of places in the U.S. and other places closed down, leaving it to China. My sense is that China thought that it could use its monopoly in the provision of rare earths to, one, make a lot of money from just the sale of rare earths, and then use that also as leverage to force other countries down the supply chain to invest in China so that they could move up the technology ladder. So, rare earths, for example, go into the magnets for wind turbines, right? So China's trying to encourage those that make wind turbines to do those in China. Because they said, okay, well, we're going to make the export price for those types of rare earths much higher. So you invest here and you can get access to those at a cheaper price. Deng Xiaoping has a famous saying, the Middle East has oil, we have rare earths. The consequence of that type of thinking, that China could use its monopoly of rare earths to squeeze the global marketplace and others, I think led to disaster for China. Not for everybody else, but for China. China increasingly regulated rare earths, moving away from market principles to administrative intervention, to the extent now that there are only a small number of rare earth providers in China in very hierarchical institutions. In 2011, went to Baotou, which is the center of northern China's rare earths, and went to the largest rare earths company there. I went out to the mine, the Baiyun mine in northern Mongolia, inner Mongolia, but the northern half. The drive out there is really dangerous. I don't encourage everyone to do it. Looked into the mine and went around with one of the mine drivers. They make about 4,000 renminbi a year, these drivers, and cancer and everything is just horrible for these folks. This is a terrible job. It's not core of the story, but I think it's just an interesting sector. So they totally intervened and made this less and less of a true market. And I think the Chinese were surprised that the rest of the world didn't sympathize with them and their conflict with Japan. Why wouldn't you agree to do something bad to Japan to teach them a lesson? Well, your relationship with Japan is different than everyone else's. And the consequence of China taking those steps led to the development of rare earths in other places. So investments in rare earths in Molycorp back here, in Australia, by Linus and other companies. But the bigger trend was the movement into, I guess the second thing would be to conserve and figure out how you can use fewer rare earths per unit of item that you need them for. And then the third thing was finding substitutes for rare earths to making them less important. All of that stuff has sent the price of rare earths falling since 2010 and 11. Maybe they've recovered a little bit, but they're not back to the prices that they were. So I think that China made a horrible mistake in trying to overly exploit its advantage or its monopoly. I think the rest of the world has figured out how to respond. There's other minerals and things that the Chinese produce a lot of that they could, or they're the number one buyer of, for example, iron ore, and they try to exert the same type of pressure. But I don't think it's had the same type of effect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy, for sharing your thoughts with us. This concludes all the time we've allotted for question and answer. And at this time, I'd also like to extend my appreciation to our virtual and our live audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will say you are a lot more popular on Facebook than I am. My wife usually just gives me a pity like on my science posts, but you're garnering a couple hundred, so we're happy and glad that everybody was able to join us, and thank you. I'd also like to take a second to thank our leadership here for who helped us realize the great potential in this program and our improvements we're going to make. Dr. Stephen Fortier, Michael Magyar, Elizabeth Scott Sangine, and Steve Textoris and Patricia Lefersky for all their hard work in helping all of us do what we do. And I'd like to again thank Dr. Scott Kennedy. Thank you so much, sir. And invite everyone to please join us next month as we present the mineral industry of Iran. It's going to be a wonderful talk. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.